have here today. So I'm joined by Linda Hardesty, the editor-in-chief at Fierce Wireless, who has been reporting on telecoms and technology since the mid-90s and has certainly attended her fair share of Mobile World Congresses. And Iain Morris, who's the news editor at Light Reading, who has been writing at the publication since 2015 and covering telecoms for 15 years. And he was also a telecoms analyst before that. So he's certainly an MWC veteran. And then we have James Pearce, who writes for Tech Informed and was previously a reporter at Mobile News and IBC. And James has been reporting on Mobile World Congress probably for the best part of the last decade. Excellent. So thank you very much for joining me, guys. So we're here today to discuss the things that companies can do to put themselves in a strong position to generate coverage and media briefings at Mobile World Congress, along with some of the things that companies should avoid doing. So I think everyone here probably knows that Mobile World Congress is a very busy time for news. Editorial desks are shrinking, and there are more and more companies wanting to get their voices heard the week surrounding the show. Now, before we get into the panel discussion, I wanted to do a really quick poll of all of you who are joining us today of when your company would typically announce news during the MWC period and the weeks running up to it. So I'm just going to launch that now. So the options there are the week of MWC, the week before MWC, 2 weeks before, 3 weeks before, and directly after. Brilliant. I think all the results are in. Let me end this and share the result with you. So interestingly enough, I think the highest percentage is the week before MWC. I'm sure some companies might choose to do some at MWC and some in the weeks running up. But yeah, that's very interesting to see. And now Babel actually did an analysis of media coverage during the week of MWC this year. We had a look at the telecoms and technology media that really influence opinion in the industry and have a good readership. And we tried to remove a lot of the newswire coverage. And there was approximately 130 articles the week of the show that mentioned Mobile World Congress. And I guess given that there were about 1,500 exhibitors, it tells you your chances of getting coverage during the show are increasingly difficult. And also, our research found that there are roughly the same number of overall articles produced from these publications the weeks before and a fortnight before MWC as there are during the actual week of the show. The reason for that is perhaps because journalists are occupied with briefings and keynotes and other activities during the show. But during Mobile World Congress, there's definitely more of an emphasis on interviews and feature pieces and articles looking at the big industry trends and where the industry is moving. So I guess this begs the question for my panel. So, when do you guys think is the right time to put out news during Mobile World Congress? Should companies be targeting those weeks before rather than the MWC when it's busier? And is this a tactic that both small and big companies should consider? So Iain, I'll start with you if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem, Paul. Yeah, I mean, I'd say definitely not the week of MWC would be my personal view. I mean, checking emails at all, which is the main way news comes to you, is just something I don't even really do. I think you might grab a quick coffee in the morning maybe and have a look at things, but a lot just goes unnoticed. And we were talking about this before we came on. I mean, I think the run up to Christmas for me is too early for sure, but I think any time from January onwards really is kind of good. And I think it obviously needs to be something we consider newsworthy to write about. That goes for any editor, I think. But to me, a company can definitely boost their chances with a good pitch, and that probably means not necessarily sending an unsolicited email, but trying to contact the editor directly. So relationship building, and there are people that will listen to and pay attention to from an agency perspective and from a company perspective, just because we kind of know who they are as much as what they have to say.
So I guess, Iain, I mean, do you think it's important then that companies take the time to kind of engage with you the months running up to Mobile World Congress, so that you can have those discussions, and you will give them the time to kind of sell in their news when it comes to it around the MWC period?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, anybody that we've kind of been used to covering before, and that we have a kind of direct relationship with, I'm going to look at what they've got to say. And it might be the case that what they're announcing isn't of great interest, but at least they're kind of on your radar, I think. And you tend to get a lot of, well, I do, and I get a lot of emails coming through in the weeks leading up to MWC from people I don't really know. And your eyes go to names that you recognize on the sort of PR side, I think, and companies that you deal with. So it's not just a sort of February, March thing. I think it's what goes on in the months leading up to it. That doesn't mean obviously pictures coming through in November or December, but it means people trying to have something to do with you throughout the course of the year for other news, and and making sure that they're kind of aware who you are. Yeah.
Makes sense. And would you agree with that approach, Linda?
Yeah. So I think smaller vendors should target our outlet during not busy times. December would be a really good time not to talk about Mobile World Congress, but to introduce themselves, and if they have any news, maybe get a news story written. Maybe January and the first couple weeks of February. To be perfectly frank, they kind of become a nuisance in the couple of weeks leading up to Mobile World Congress. As if we don't have enough going on, getting 500 emails a day. Would you like to speak with this person that you don't know? Is not good. I have one insider tip. The minute Mobile World Congress Barcelona is over, it's completely dropped, and no one cares a hoot about it anymore. Then is the time when editors are scrambling for news. We've been completely inundated for the last couple of months, and now we don't have anything. If I was doing PR for a small company, I'd seize the day. Whenever you could get an article written.
Right, thanks, Linda. Yeah, that makes sense. There often is a quiet time after Mobile World Congress that companies could exploit. Anything to add there, James?
I think Linda's hit upon it perfectly, in the sense that if you're a smaller company, you're trying to shout into a environment where there's much bigger companies that are taking up a lot of the noise, a lot of the air. So it's about timing, it's about the message that you send. But I think the thing is that if you kind of strip it back to the original question and what you put in the poll, if you think what Mobile World Congress is, it's a chance for us to be on the ground meeting people. It's the chance to be seeing speakers talk that we might not otherwise get the chance to. So whether you're a reporter or an editor, when you're there, you don't actually want to spend that much time in the press room writing up a press release. And anyone who's been in the Mobile World Congress press room in the FERA knows that you don't want to spend any time there, because you're probably not going to get a desk anyway. So the fact is, you want to be, that's your opportunity to kind of arrange meetings. But the week before is also quite challenging, because effectively you're trying to arrange your diary. And unfortunately, the truth of the matter is, and I'm sure a lot of the clients, the smaller players here, know this, their meetings aren't going to be the priority if we can speak to an executive, a high-level executive at a big company, a Fortune 500 or something like that. You're going to try and prioritize that. And if you're prioritizing that when you're arranging your diary, then the same happens to the news, because if you're rearranging your diary and you're getting, Linda said, 500 emails, and that's a good day sometimes around MWC. You've got a lot going on. So the week before, you don't really have that much time to write up that much news either. So it's about kind of building it into the schedule. And ultimately, MWC is a really useful tool in that it's a chance to get loads of people in one small area and to meet and to talk to them and get a load of stuff that you'll be rolling out over the next few weeks. But I think Linda hit it perfectly. Couldn't have said it better. It doesn't matter once it's gone. contextualizing things as part of MWC or any other event for that matter, it doesn't matter what's gone. You'll still use the content, but the news and the framing around the news doesn't matter. So if your announcement is really important to you as a company, and often it is, but in the grand scheme of things, it might be less important. If you want to get some coverage of that, then maybe just avoid using MWC as the kind of core talking point, because actually everyone else is doing that. So find something else that makes it an interesting angle, or find a time when things are a little bit quieter. You know, December, everyone's scrambling for stuff and coming back after Christmas. Same over the summer, you know, when parts of Europe go on holiday and things cool down a little bit. We're all struggling for news then, comparatively. So I think that timing and that understanding that MWC isn't the be all and end all, maybe that's a bad thing to say on a webinar about MWC, is really important.
Yeah, thanks very much, James. I guess for the bigger companies, they will be slightly more confident that they will get their news reported on. But of course, you know, even for them, it's not guaranteed. Many organised companies will send journalists news under embargo ahead of the show, so that you can line it up to go live when you're there. James, you mentioned that often actually the week before the show, you're also really busy, you know, sorting out your schedule and things like that. So when is the best time to receive news under embargo if a company does want it to go live during the show? And what can they give you to maximize the chance that you will cover it when it goes live?
I think,
sorry, go ahead, James.
I think a couple of weeks before is the ideal kind of slot, because obviously I think we all appreciate that you can't sign it off too early. One thing I'd say on embargoes, which is really important as well, don't just send me an email saying under embargo and then put the press release, because from a legal perspective, not that I think most journalists would do this, because we're not there to be bad people, but we don't have to stick to an embargo unless we agree to it. An embargo is a kind of a fair agreement. It's a fair usage agreement. And so many times I've had people send things through, and, you know, I haven't published them because I don't want to aggravate people, but they've said, this is under embargo. Before I've even agreed to an embargo, you have to agree to something like that. So it's really important that you have that discussion, but also, as Iain touched upon, it gets it in front of you. If you've spoken to somebody before, you're going to notice their email more because you recognize the name. So nobody loves phone calls. We don't love being harassed, but occasionally having that message or building a relationship from a PR side and having a relationship with either a company or a PR exec helps us, because we know that person. So we know that they're going to send something, or expect or hope at least that they're going to send something that is relevant, and then we'll want to cover it. And that embargo time frame, if you're going to put it on an embargo, then at least kind of give us a phone call or let us know before, so we can kind of make sure that it's right for us and that we want to agree to the embargo.
Great, thanks, James. And how about for yourself, Iain? Do you like to receive news under embargo ahead of the event? And would you ever line articles and news up to run during the show? And what helps you get those across the lines? Is it perhaps interviews ahead of a show to help you build up those pieces?
Yeah, I mean, just on the embargo point that James touched on, I think I totally agree with him about companies sending things through saying under embargo and you've not agreed. I think the other danger is people miss. I mean, it's usually in bold text and it's in red at the start, but there's a couple of times when I've not looked carefully and missed things, and then there's a danger it goes through and you're not doing it in bad faith. But I think one problem with under embargo announcements where they're trying to get coverage at the show is that it's coming out maybe on Monday morning or Tuesday morning, and it just sort of gets buried. If it's a fairly small company and everybody's wanting to hear what Ericsson's CEO said that morning, or some major deal that Deutsche Telekom's done, then it's probably just going to get lost in the noise. And I think there's something to be said for maybe having announcements in the week, actually the news coming out the week before MWC and not during the week even. I mean, the week after, as Linda says, is kind of good because it really is a kind of a hole in the news, I think, that week. But on the other hand, I can understand why companies want coverage leading up to the show, and at the show they're trying to generate interest for people to go over to their stands presumably and buy things. So it's kind of really difficult to get the balance right. But I don't necessarily think if you're a small vendor that having a news announcement out on Monday is maybe the best thing. And for sure, if it's a small vendor with something interesting to say and I've got capacity to cover it, I'm going to do that in advance of the show. I'm probably not going to do it at the show, but
Yeah.
it's just releasing it onto our website on Monday is, it's maybe not a great idea.
Okay. Anything to add there, Linda?
Yeah, I would say that I'm always on the lookout for top news. It doesn't really matter to me if it's embargoed or not. I mean, I could see an embargo and it looks kind of interesting. I maybe even plan on covering it, but then if something bigger happens, it ends up on the cutting room floor. Because our main goal is just always to cover the top news of the day. That's why I'm just giving the advice that if you don't have the top news of the day and you're a smaller vendor, you're just going to get lost in the shuffle. And so you'd be more strategic, to find a different time. I would say that everyone that comes to a trade show has an agenda, and that includes journalists. Some people are at their booths and they want to meet, they want to make sales, or they want to make new customer contacts. I mean, it's just kind of weird actually how everyone is running around with their agenda. But our agenda is to cover the very top news from the show. So that usually means operator news, high profile people. I mean, if Elon Musk is talking like he did a couple years ago, that's going to get a priority over some kind of embargo.
Yeah.
We have to meet with people. We're trying to meet with the highest level people that we possibly can. And then of course, we have to write stories, and we're a small staff. So I guess I'm kind of beating a drum here, but it's like almost any other time of the year would be better to reach out to us with your vendor news.
Right. So I guess a large proportion of the news you'll also cover at the show is from interviews that you actually have on the show floor. And how would you say that is split between, the interviews you've got and then the live news that you receive in your inbox? Is it roughly a 50-50 weight, or do you tend to focus on the companies that you're actually meeting with?
I don't have a percentage of how that works because I'm always just looking for the top news.
Yeah.
And you never really know. I mean, the fun of being in the news business is you never really know. Is it going to come from a press release? Is it going to come from an embargo? Is it going to come from a news conference? Or are you going to talk to someone and they're going to tell you something really interesting? So yeah, I don't really have a breakdown of, how it's all going to play out.
How about yourself, Ian? I know you tend to write quite a lot of feature pieces of the show. How does that work for you?
I tend to find when I'm at the show, I don't really have much of a clue of what's going on, to be honest with you. In fact, the years I have not gone to MWC, I felt I've got a better grip on what the big news of the day is, because you're wondering, you line up your meetings before, and I tend to have companies that I want to go and meet. So, the last few years I've been really sort of interested in meeting CTO level people if possible on the telco side, and then maybe one or two big vendors if I can get a sort of senior executive. And I guess a lot of journalists are going after those kinds of people, but you get those meetings lined up, and then you're going to want to stick to them. And then your days, maybe a few of those meetings, and it becomes quite hard to sort of, you can be in these interviews asking, the interesting questions that you think of, but it can be quite hard to sometimes figure out, I think, what the big news stories are around those meetings that you're having. So, which is kind of, I guess, in a way, it's useful to, if you have the resources, to have somebody who's not maybe at the show, or even maybe they're at the show, but they're just kind of keeping an eye on what other people are writing and what the kind of noise is and the conversation is. So, because I do tend to think when I'm there, I'm doing the meetings I've got lined up, and then I'm trying to generate some content based on that if possible. Yeah. And there are times when I've been aware of someone saying, "Oh, did you hear this came out today?" And then as Linda says, then it's kind of an opportunity to pivot maybe and write about that instead of the one-on-one chat that you have with Orange about 5G that can probably wait a couple of days. But it can be a bit sort of difficult to sort of get a sense of everything that's happening, I think, when you're there.
Yeah. Is that the same for yourself then, James?
I think so. I mean, essentially, trying to process what you've heard in a meeting that you've had with someone straight away and turn it around for a news story is an art. It's so hard to do. And sometimes you have to do it because you're like, oh my God, they said something really cool. I want to write that down before they say it to every other journalist that they're meeting. So you try and turn it around really quickly, but a lot of it will stay back for me personally. And this has happened with whichever publication I've been back. It's quite often, if we've had a magazine or something that we've been saving content for, then some of the more interesting stuff will be held back for that. Also, Linda touched upon one of the issues. Journalists, the teams of journalists in general, we're not getting bigger for most publications, so we have more to do in a very short time. And you can go to MWC and have 30, 40, 50, maybe even more meetings. Where does that leave the time to go and write up a news story or to write up a press conference? And yet sometimes those are the most interesting places. So for us, it's about working out the best schedule. And that means for the people watching, it's about making sure that you give us a reason to include you in our schedule. But ultimately, when it comes to the question of news from the show, I tend to keep a lot of it back, and then we'll write up a kind of roundup as to what's going on. But I often feel like the other guys do that. I don't have a clue what the main takeaways are if I've not been there, unless I happen to catch, the Mobile World Live video or something like that as I'm walking down one of the halls and go, oh, didn't even know that person was here this year. Great. Because it's just so busy. It takes up nothing is more tiring than a week at MWC where you're going from pillar to post and trying to fit in as much as you can, and that's why it's so competitive for our time, I think.
Yeah, and I would just jump in and say, and we like to eat and sleep and have a little fun too. We like to go out to some of those dinners and see Barcelona. So really, it's just such a tiny time frame.
Announce it over tapas. Announce things over tapas.
So, and Linda, you mentioned that you tend to just cover the biggest news from the show. Is there anything else that companies can do, like any other kind of news that may stand out for you? If for example, if it's a smaller company, what can they do to get their news on the radar?
I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer. They just need to have some really big news. And sometimes small companies do have some really big news. Everybody will be talking about some companies that people don't have on their radar. I mean, that kind of happened with Rakuten at first. Nobody ever heard Rakuten. But the buzz started happening and, so they got attention. But I mean, just authentic, interesting news, making an impact that affects a lot of people is the best way to get journalists' attention.
What about yourself, Ian? Is there anything that companies can do to try and get their news on your radar?
I mean, it's hard. It's the same as Linda says. It's what's newsworthy and what's interesting, and that's a difficult one because there's always a danger with a small vendor that you look at it and it's just another product announcement. It's a new widget. Why is it strategically significant for the industry? And I mean, Linda mentioned Rakuten. That's a game-changing thing potentially, and it's something everybody's talking about all the time. So not everybody's a kind of Japanese version of Amazon building a new telecom network. So it's a difficult thing to put your finger on why you necessarily cover something. I mean, I know for me, when I'm doing content at the show, it's not, we're getting back to the whole press release thing, and when we want to be updated on announcements, a lot of it's not really announcements driven, I guess. And James is alluding to this, you do your interviews and you'll save some back for stories that you might write in the subsequent weeks, but you sometimes they're jumping on, you're hopefully actually jumping on something that someone said to you and maybe not to anybody else, rather than taking something from a press release. And maybe their press release is just a way into having an interesting conversation with a journalist about a particular topic, and then they come out with something that's a little bit controversial, or something they haven't told somebody else that they're about to do, and that becomes the kind of basis for your story. But the magic formula is a hard one, really. I think when you're a smaller vendor, when I come up with that, I'm going to move into PR and charge people lots of money for my my advice.
Well, that's probably a good point for us to segue actually into Mobile World Congress briefings. So we're going to do another quick poll actually. This one looking at how often media briefings at Mobile World Congress actually result in coverage. So let me launch this one. Right, we'll end that now. So let me share the results. There you go. So the highest percentage, 50% of people said that interviews rarely result in coverage. There's a lucky 40% that said that they often do, and of course 10% all the time, because you can never really guarantee it. So that leads me to my next kind of set of questions really around media briefings. So what makes you agree to a briefing? And I guess a double question here, and how many briefings do you typically actually take during the week of a show versus before? Linda, I'll start with you.
When I think about my schedule for Mobile World Congress, actually meeting individual people at their booths, probably 5 a day. It's interesting on the poll that people said rarely do they get coverage. Personally, I'm not one who likes to waste my time. I feel like I'm loath to meet with someone for half an hour, take notes, ask questions, and then not do anything with it. I mean, it has to be a really horrible meeting for me to not do something with that. Oftentimes later, or I'll write a story later, or I'll blend it in with some other story, or I'll even remember it a month later and pull a quote, you know, from the person. So, yeah.
Okay. Great. And what about yourself, James? What attracts you to speak to a company, and how many briefings will you typically take during that week?
I think the first and most important thing is relevance. So it's understanding what my audience is. Now, obviously, I understand, but if it's not relevant to my audience, I'm not going to take up a briefing. If you're pitching something that is, you know, really in-depth telco, well, I'm looking after writing for enterprise customers quite often at the moment and tech informed. So previous job, sure, that might be great for me, or it might be great for Iain, or, you know, for another publication, but it's not necessarily what I want. So it's understanding when you approach why it would be relevant to the people who read Tech Informed. At the same time, it's putting up somebody who is a high enough level at that company to make it worthwhile. If you're putting up the CMO, and there are some brilliant CMOs out of there, but I've got to be honest, I'm a lot less interested in what the CMO is saying to the CEO or the CTO, CIO, or whatever. And the reason for that is because the CMO's job is to market and promote that company. And I'm not there to market and promote that company. I'm there to find out what that company's doing and the relevance it has in the market. And I think the other one is having a kind of understanding around the topics and something to shout about, something that really draws me in, that makes me want to give up half an hour of my time and walk across 7 halls to get to you. Because as it comes down to it, you know, I tend to overbook myself. I got the opposite approach to Linda, I think. And it's a bad habit, because I'm like, yeah, that could be really interesting, or I could use that for that. And I don't like wasting my time either, but I'm just really bad at scheduling my diary when it comes to MWC, so I tend to overbook. So if I'm going to have to walk from hall 1 to hall 8 to go and see you, and I'm doing that off the back of 4 consecutive meetings, then the chances of me by that point being hungry and wanting to go and join the giant queue to get an overpriced sandwich is, if that's my choice and your meeting doesn't look that relevant, then I'm more likely to cancel it, or to, you know, to not want to go, or not to agree to it in the first place.
Yeah.
So if I'm booking, you know, at my worst, I think I was doing like 40 meetings in a not in a day, that would be insane. 40 meetings across 3 days of conference, right? That is a lot. And that is a lot to write up when I get back as well. And I always try to give coverage when people have done it. But if I've gone to meet you and you've not said anything interesting, or if I was supposed to be meeting your CEO and they've been pulled up with something else. And we do understand that sometimes, you know, schedules change as much for journalists as they do for executives. So I'm stuck with somebody a lot lower down the pecking order. I'm not going to be inclined when I come back and review all my content to go, actually, I want to give this a really big push, or I want this to be because it's really interesting, because it might fall down the pecking order. So essentially, yeah, those three things: make sure it's relevant to my audience, make sure there's something to shout about, and make sure that there's somebody senior or interesting enough to kind of give it the weight that it deserves.
Is that the same for yourself then, Iain? Are you kind of looking for companies to tell you what they're going to be briefing you on when you meet? Or are you kind of primarily interested by that kind of CTO, like you said, that tier of spokesperson within a company?
I am more recently, yeah. I mean, I agree with everything James said there about why you'd want to talk to somebody. In the last few years, I've increasingly found I'm going out to MWC and actually taking meetings because I've got in touch and lined something up. You know, I want to meet Tariq Amin from Rakuten. He's there. Can I have a meeting with him? You know, and you get something in the diary and you do it that way, and you kind of proactive rather than reactive, and then that doesn't often leave a lot of scope for doing the, you know, the smaller companies that might be interesting to speak to, which is why I think sometimes, you know, that we're talking about this, when's a good time to get news out to you. That's why the 2 weeks leading up to MWC, I think, can be useful for doing those sorts of, you know, briefings on the phone or on a Zoom call. In terms of the number, I mean, I'm probably at the opposite end of the scale to James these days, and even fewer than Linda. I try not to do very many briefings at all, really, because I find that I'm a bit surprised by the poll result there saying, you know, that only 10% of people always get coverage. I mean, like Linda, if you take the time to meet somebody and you spend half an hour talking to them, I want to try and give them some coverage. And it might not be an in-depth profile on that company that's 1,000 words long, but you might work it into a bigger feature on a topic, and it might just be a quote. But it's very rare that I sort of just do something and don't do anything with it at all. Yeah, so, but as I say, I try to do, I mean, I think last year I said, or this year rather, I was saying I don't really want to do more than 4 or 5 briefings a day, and it kind of ended up that way. And that's, you know, you add that up, if you have half an hour meeting with someone, 4 or 5 meetings, that's quite a big chunk of your day. If you're going to try and maybe go to one press conference as well or something, and there are a couple that happen that you know, Deutsche Telekom always does a press conference with the CTO or the CEO, and you kind of feel that's something that's worth being at. And there's a few other things of that nature going on. So you add that all together and you think about trying to build some writing time into your day. Anything more, I just tend to find I'm not very productive at the show. And then you're working in the evenings, and those nice tapas meals out are just not happening at all, because you're just sitting in your hotel room trying to get things done till 11 o'clock, and then it's just miserable, frankly. So yeah.
So when you do take briefings, what can companies do to ensure that they generate coverage or generate those longer form feature pieces?
I mean, if it's something that's right in my, you know, if it's a topic I'm really interested in, and I think we'd probably talk about that at some point before this webinar's over, but if it's one of those key topics that Light Reading covers and that I'm always writing about, and a company's reaching out, and yeah, and then a good way obviously to find out what any journalist is interested in is to read their stuff. You know, I think you do get the occasional pitches that come in where someone says, oh, I read your article on this, and you can actually tell they have, and it's like quite nice when people do that, because there's nothing worse than somebody writing and saying, oh, do you have a view on this topic, or would you like to talk to somebody, and you've already talked to them, or you've already written something about it. It's just really, it's quite infuriating, I think. So I think, you know, realizing what journalists are interested in covering is a good thing. And then, as I say, I think those 2 or 3 weeks leading up to the show, if it's somebody that doesn't fall into that category of CTO for one of Europe's biggest operators, and I might be able to get a meeting with them, and I'm going to try and meet someone like that at the show because I wouldn't at any other time, then I think those 2 weeks leading up to it are really valuable for smaller companies, maybe doing phone briefings and that kind of thing.
Thanks, Iain. What about yourself, Linda? What can companies do to help ensure they generate coverage during an interview?
I haven't found that that's really been a problem in all the hundreds of interviews that I've done at shows. I generally kind of take charge of the thing. I think that's kind of what reporters mainly do when, you know, they've scheduled an interview with someone, is that, I mean, I like to ask the questions. And people are usually pretty good about just answering the questions. I don't want to be given a prepared customer speech. I really do not like looking at slide presentations. And you can tell that those slide presentations were prepared for customers because they're real markety, salesy. I mean, I stopped typing and I just sit there, you know, because I'm not going to be a customer of their company. So I think that's inappropriate to use those same slide decks for journalists. I guess one pet peeve I have is sometimes really enthusiastic engineers and tech people, they want to walk me around the booth and point to these like television screens that have incomprehensible charts and graphs all over the place, and talk for a really long time about, you know, why this is trending and that. And I can't make heads or tails out of any of that. I can't type answers to my questions. So that's just one thing that I would advise not doing.
Good tip.
Yeah, I
I
completely
haven't had that
agree with
happen too much. Yeah.
I think that's awful. In fact, one of the things I think that would be nice to see at the stands is something. I mean, I seem to remember last year they had some of these 5G connected robots, you know, the ones that look like killer dogs. And I did an interview with Verizon's chief strategy officer, and she had one, but it wasn't working. It was for some reason, there was something wrong with it. And I just thought this would be, you know, just for a little sort of video snippet on the website or a photo, it would have been it's much more appealing to a reporter, obviously, than a screen showing how bits of software slot together that, you know, for someone who's not a top coder, you just can't make any sense of whatsoever. There's a kind of mismatch there really between what the engineer thinks you find interesting and what you actually do find interesting, clearly.
I think that's a really important point that Iain's touched on, and Linda. It's about what's interesting. It's about having something interesting to say or show or demonstrate, because ultimately the point of journalists is we act as a filter. We get hit with all of this stuff and then we filter down to find the most interesting things. So quite often if we go to a briefing and somebody's just reeling off the marketing deck and not answering questions, or not really answering the questions, trying to avoid answering them, that's not going to get you as much or as good coverage as somebody who is kind of open and happy to talk about topics. Now, I know, obviously, there's a corporate line. I appreciate that you can't just go off running your mouth. You can't all be John Leguieu and he was at T-Mobile or whatever. You can't, not everyone can be that executive. I get that. But the fact is that he got so much press for that company that they ended up with a massive takeover because he did take that approach, and it works. It gets coverage because it's interesting. If you have a robot there that works, then I'm going to want to take a little video of it. One of the biggest at this year's MWC, biggest crowds I saw was Telefonica's stand, and they had a robot bartender. And I mean, it was the worst bartender I ever had. I got a pint of beer that was about that full. It was funny, and it got attention. It got people there. And then they managed to, when I spoke to somebody from Telefonica, they managed to link it back to what they're doing. If you can do that, something visual or something that's interesting, then you're going to get coverage. I feel like I'm the one dragging the average down on that poll because I do too many briefings, but I'm also slightly more brutal in it that if I meet somebody and it's the wrong briefing, I won't cover it. I don't have time to cover it. And I feel bad about that. I don't love doing that, but ultimately you need to give me something. It's my job to try and extract interesting things from you, but you need to be willing to give a little bit as well, I think.
Absolutely. Okay, so my final question is, what are the trends that you're particularly interested in covering at the show next year? Linda, I'll start off with you.
Well, they're just the trends that are kind of popping right now in our coverage. So I'll be looking for private wireless because that's been really hot the last couple of years. Fixed wireless access has really popped. So I'll be asking people about that. The thing that I think is the most exciting this year kind of has to do with all that satellite to real mobile phones. I'm not sure what the schedule is going to look like at Mobile World Congress, but I hope there's some satellite stuff because I always say to my editors, I mean, the root word of news is new, right? It's not old. So I think satellite stuff is the newest and most exciting stuff I'll be looking at. And then I just like to touch base with the top operators if they're putting out any big announcements, which they do tend to save for the show. And they do have press conferences sometimes to announce really top news. And of course, I don't know what that is. So I just have to wait and see.
Of course. How about you, Ian?
Yeah, I mean, some of the ones that Linda just mentioned, and it's kind of company driven to some extent. I mean, I'd want to, I'd want to get in touch with the top telcos, and if they've got anything to say, any big strategic initiatives, then we're going to cover that. I'm not going to sound very original here. I mean, the other things would be things like 5G evolution, which covers a broad range of topics because it gets you into things like, the enterprise opportunity and later releases of it, and even moving towards 6G. But it's, it's something we have to monitor nevertheless. There's a couple of other ones that are kind of hobby horses, I suppose, of mine, really. I mean, Open RAN's one that generates a lot of interest, even though it's still a pretty small part of the market. Always seems to be a hot topic, so I'm sure that's something I'll be writing about next year. The cloud, the public cloud, the big hyperscalers and their kind of presence at the show, and what they're doing with the telcos, I think is always interesting, and they're kind of becoming a bigger deal on the kind of networking side these days, it seems. So I'll be writing about that. And then there's those kinds of fun ones, I suppose, like robot dogs and the metaverse. I mean, whether they're actual stories or kind of photos and snippets, I don't know, but yeah, they're kind of fun to have.
Is it too early to be talking about 6G?
No, I mean 6G. I think with 5G evolution, I think looking out towards 6G. I mean, I wonder if anybody's going to say anything to me this year about 6G that's different from what I heard. I keep saying this year, next year, that's different from what I heard this year. But yeah, it's, if someone says, look, 6G is going to be this, and they're not just talking about whatever it is, terahertz spectrum or wacky use cases that we've heard before, and they've got a kind of new take on it, then that's definitely something that we'd write about.
Great, thanks, Ian. And what about yourself, James?
Well, it's slightly different for me because Tech Informed doesn't have the legacy that Pearce or Like Reading has, in that we're only a year old. So we spent most of this year discovering, as editor, I spent most of this year determining what exactly was really interesting for our audience, who our audience were, building that out. So for us, it's do you know what it is? It's use cases of telecoms. It's the 5G private networks. It's the IoT in factories. It's those end users and how telcos or their partners or the kind of distributors or whoever, the people who sit in that economy, have helped big businesses transform and change what they're doing. Because ultimately telco is about end users, whether it be consumers or whether it be businesses. And so it's where that kind of connectivity and new technology fits in, and it brings in things like metaverse that we touched upon. I don't know whether they're going to be the big topics next year, because it was a massive topic this year, but then we've suddenly seen Meta rowing back on what their investment is in that area. So you suddenly kind of like, oh, it might change. A few years ago, everyone was talking about crypto and blockchain. That market's crashed. So is it going to be a big topic? I don't know. But our job as journalists, and I'm sure the guys will agree, is to be really hot on that and to kind of have an idea as we're going into it. What I found really good about this year's MWC was, after writing about 5G for a decade, I suddenly started seeing some things that I went, oh, 5G, I can see why it matters now. Where a few years ago, if especially COVID didn't help, but pre-COVID, 5G was just launching and it was a bit like, yeah. now we started to see it. So when you ask about 6G as well, it's kind of like, it's going to be really early to talk about it, and people will come up with some crazy ideas as to what it means, but we won't know for another 5 years as to what that's going to be. But ultimately, for me, it's seeing those use cases. If you come to me with a really good case study, or a client or a partner or something, and you can say, we've used our 5G network to support this mining operation in Colombia or something like that, then great. I love it. Show me everything. Show me all the pictures. Tell me everything about it, and I will write something happily about that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, everyone. That's the end of my questions. So I'd like to now open this up to the audience, and we've already had one question in from Andy Bryant that I can kick off with. So if you've got a collection of related telco stories between December to February, is it better to bundle multiple things into one big announcement, or trickle the content story by story over a number of weeks or months before MWC? Iain, I don't know if you've got an opinion on that.
Yeah, I prefer I think I prefer it bundled, to be honest with you. I don't really like seeing it when you get a vendor kind of coming out with 10 or 15 sort of product release announcements, you know, especially when it's hard to sort of tie them back to, you know, is this really strategically significant? Is it something I should care about? I think it's better to have those sort of wrapped into one statement and then pitched as we're doing some kind of, you know, bigger refresh perhaps. And it's also just, from a journalist perspective, it's also quite messy, I think, when you see these things flying into your inbox in the weeks leading up to it that are all from one company, and they're 15 different things, and they're probably related anyway. So I'd go for the bundling approach, to be honest, on that.
Right. We have another question from Marcus. How do you feel about joint briefings between companies as a means of adding more value or perspective to a story? Does anyone have a view on that?
I think if there is a real reason for it, then can be, coming back to what I was saying about case studies, if you've got a partner and you've worked together on this project, then that's great, because I get different elements of it, and I don't have to go and dig around for those elements to tell the full story, because often, you know, if it's just one company and their partner's not there, it's hardest to cover it. I want to know what their partner's doing. Ultimately, I want to know what the enterprise side of it is. And I think kind of you need to have a real reason for doing it, but it can be useful if there's a genuine link. Having said that, there are times where you just want to speak to the person from one company, because that makes the interview much easier, and it makes it much more, the story that you're going to tell make more sense.
Yeah.
I would say those two questions about bundling and also bundling people together in interviews are kind of similar. I would say that it just depends. What's most clear and effective, you know, to the journalists. Sometimes a bundled press release makes sense, I guess, for a small company that has a number of things that they want to convey, then that makes sense. There are instances of really big companies, I can think of some in Silicon Valley, that bundle unrelated announcements all in one massive, you know, 6-page press release. I'd rather have those broken out. So yeah. I guess it just depends. And then in terms of the interviews, I would have to agree with James that generally it's more clear just talking to one executive or a couple of executives from the same company, as opposed to bringing in a different company in the same interview. Sometimes it can cause confusion, unless there's a really good reason.
I just add on the bundling thing. I think the bundling is fine, and Linda kind of touched on this, Andy, and if there's a story there to tell, or a smaller company wants to do it, if you have a few products and there's a real good, you can turn it into one story that makes sense, then new announcements, wrap it up in a PR bow, get your CEO to hand it over to me himself, and that makes a really good bit, because I get time to question him about what's going on, but ultimately you get your news kind of tied up into an interview or into a wider feature, because it's already kind of got a narrative. And ultimately, as journalists, what we're doing is putting a narrative onto things, onto news, onto announcements, onto, you know, or contextualizing them, and that really helps with that.
Great. So I've got a question from Theo Wilson. So it's been mentioned that you get a load of emails around the time of Mobile World Congress, and possibly too many to deal with. Is there a more effective way than email to get your attention? Perhaps Theo suggested attach a bottle of whiskey. Scroll attach a bottle of whiskey, perhaps. Ian, I'll start with you on that one.
Bottle of whiskey is a good idea for sure. I mean, emails is. I'm more likely to notice them in the weeks leading up to MWC, obviously, than the days before or during the event. But I still think it's not the best way of getting in touch with journalists these days, really. I mean, the best companies sort of give you a call, and as I say, it's often someone that you know already, so you're immediately prepared to speak to them and to listen to what they've got to say if it's someone you've kind of built up a relationship with on the PR side. So I always think that's the best approach, really. I'll take there's people I know in the PR industry that I'll take calls from, and whereas you see numbers that you don't recognize coming through when you're having a busy day, you just ignore it, or some email turns up in your inbox and you don't know who the company is. You might look at it, but you might not. And that's a process that should go on throughout the year. That's not just about Mobile World Congress. That's obviously about getting to know people over a period of time, and depending on where you're based in the world, I know it can be easier or more difficult. There's PR guys in America that I don't see very much of. I know, but I don't see very much of them, as opposed to people in London where it's very easy for me. But I still think that relationship building is pretty key to getting news to journalists.
And what about you, Linda? Do you accept calls, or do you prefer to be emailed or perhaps contacted on social media?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, social media. That's kind of like our company uses Teams, and you can just quickly chat with each other. And I have responded to some people on LinkedIn. I'm not saying to abuse it, but that's a very immediate way to perhaps get attention. I kind of hate phone calls these days. I'm like terrified to hit, answer when it's just a number, and I don't know what I'm going to be getting myself into. Yeah, so I mean, email is probably the most common way, and the social media thing is a good idea.
How about you, James?
I'm sort of in between. I don't actually mind a call occasionally because I'm terrible at kind of picking up on emails. Having said that, I'm of the generation where calling is seen as a really unusual thing. And I think bear in mind as well, if we've all got teams working under us or whatever, there's going to be that's even worse as you kind of get down the generational shift. So if you have people who are in there from kind of Gen Z who are just starting out as journalists, and I am generalizing a little bit, but they're probably not used to like kind of picking up the phone, calling out or taking calls. And a lot of them, especially newer journalists, won't have worked as much in that office environment where they have their own phone, their own office phone there to do it. So I think, that carries an element of kind of uncertainty depending who you're contacting, but ultimately it all bundles into what Iain said. It's about having that relationship and kind of knowing who you're pitching to. If you know that they're really good on email, because some people are really hot on email, send them an email. If you know that they're really good on social media, as Linda is, then it might be going down that route. If you know that they hate phone calls, then don't call them. But if they're fine with phone calls, then give them a ring. Take them out for a drink. Send them a bottle of whiskey. There we go.
Absolutely. And shameless plug here. I think the benefits of having a PR agency that is experienced in this area is that they will know the best ways to contact journalists, whether it's phone calls or emails or social media.
I would like to say that just with phone calls, it's so weird how reaching out to people has evolved. But I almost feel bad about calling people for an interview. Like, it just seems like better manners these days that you have to ping them in advance to make sure that they have time to talk to you. There's only a few people that I pick up the phone and they answer and we have an interview like the old days. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that's brought me to the end of the questions, unless anyone else has got Any last minute questions? And just as a reminder, you can type your questions into the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom. So unless we get any more questions for you through in the last couple of seconds, I think we can call it there. All right, well, thanks ever so much, Iain, Linda, James. That was really, really interesting. I hope everyone watching found that useful as well.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.